Cyrus, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you with us today. We're going to ask if you want to give some opening comments on just generally the committee system in the U.S. House, and then we'll go to questions.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Glad to be with all of you. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the musical Hamilton, but it talks about the room where it happens. In Congress, generally speaking, the committee rooms are the rooms where it happens. There are roughly 15 standing committees in the House, a similar number in the Senate. Virtually all members are assigned to committees, in most cases, 2 to 3 committees, maybe more in the Senate. But when you think about Congress and what it does, how a bill becomes a law, that happens through the committee process. Each committee has a varying number of members. So some in the House of Representatives are as small as 13 members. Some are as large as 60 to 70. The ratio on the committees, or the number of majority members or minority members of the committee, is determined by the size of the majority and the overall, right? So in the House and the Senate currently, Republicans have the majority, and they have a narrow majority in the House and a narrow majority in the Senate. So that means that the ratio of Republicans to Democrats on those committees, both in the House and in the Senate, is quite narrow. In the Senate, in most cases, the ratio is 1. There's one more member of the majority party, in the case of Republicans, than there are. Here in the House, we have a little bit different approach in the Senate. So we have slightly larger ratios. In most cases, it would be 4 or 5 more members of the majority than the minority. There are 435 members of the House versus 100 members of the Senate. So there's a lot more to fit onto committees. And also, in the House, we are a majoritarian body versus the Senate, which is much more, arguably collegial, but because of the filibuster, requires much more agreement between both parties. So that is reflected in the fact that we have a more majoritarian, a larger, ratio in the House than they have in the Senate. But once committees are established and members are assigned, they get to work. So each year in Congress, there's roughly 5,000 bills in the House or Senate that are introduced. And of those, maybe 10% get any consideration at all. The first step, whenever any bill or resolution is introduced in Congress, is that it is immediately referred to a committee. So there's the parliamentarian in the House of Representatives, and a similar thing in the Senate, looks at the bill and says, what is the topic? And then assigns it to the committee, right? I worked at the Education Committee, so any bill that had to do with education issues, the parliamentarian will read it and say, oh, this is about education. We're going to send that to the Education Committee. Or this bill has to do with train, so we're going to send it to the Transportation Committee, or the military, so it goes to Armed Services. In some cases, bills go to multiple committees, which is unfortunate when it happens, because those bills are much harder to move. But to keep this short, I'll just say, every bill comes in and gets assigned to a committee. And, each of these committees, if there are 5,000 bills introduced and there are only 15 committees in the House, each committee is getting hundreds of bills referred to it, and they're not going to move all of them. So, that's sort of one of the powers of the committee chair. So each committee has a chairman or chairwoman. So of the, majority members, one is selected by varying means to be the chair or chairwoman. And they get to choose what gets on the schedule, what events the committee holds, what meetings it holds, the legislation they consider, et cetera. And one of the greatest reflections of that, the significance of that post, is deciding which bills get consideration and which don't. So, if you're a bill and you're one of the 5,000, you're one of the, let's say, 250 that gets assigned to the Education Committee, they'll pick some of them, or they'll pick a topic about which many of those bills are on, and they'll hold a hearing. So you guys have probably all seen a snippet of a congressional hearing or a state legislature hearing. The members of the committee sit at the dais, and in front of them they have witnesses. Typically in the House, it's usually 4 witnesses, and the majority party gets to pick 3 of them, and the minority party gets to pick 1. Another reflection of why it matters who has the majority in the House or the Senate is that victory is reflected in a lot of different procedures. But these hearings are pretty straightforward. It's not that much different than a community meeting or other things that you may have seen. The witnesses, at the start of the hearing, the chairman, and then the ranking minority member, so the highest ranking member of the minority party in the committee, the two of them give an opening statement, talk a little bit about the topic at hand, welcome the witnesses, preview what they might want to ask about later, and then they recognize the witnesses to give opening statements. And the witnesses will talk typically for 5 minutes each. So there's about 20 minutes of talking from these four witnesses at the start. And then the committee members go in order of seniority to ask questions. So, seniority is who first in is highest up. So if you were elected 25 years ago, you get to go before someone who was elected a few months before. Or how long you've been on that committee specifically. Were you on the committee for 10 years or 1 year? And members each get to ask questions for 5 minutes. So it goes very, very quickly. There are four witnesses. You only have 5 minutes for questions. So they tend to pick one or two witnesses and just have one or two questions. And once the hearing is concluded, the committee prints that hearing, gives a record of it to everyone so that they're able to gain the wisdom or the information that was shared at that hearing. And not every bill or topic that gets a hearing will necessarily have a bill move. But for the percentage that do move, the committee moves on to something called a markup. And that is one of the most exciting events that happens in Congress. Again, we're talking here about how a bill becomes a law. If the bill gets a hearing, and then when you have the markup, they bring the actual text of the bill, and the text has to be shared with all the members in advance. There's no surprising anyone. And they could theoretically read the bill, but that's not actually done. But they have a similar thing, an opening statement, and then a specific member says, I move a particular bill, and they start the process. And the first step in that process, after people, again, this is Congress, so people are going to talk about it for a bit. But then you move into the amendment process. And that is very interesting. In both the House and the Senate, once you get to the House or Senate floor, the full House, the full Senate is considering a bill, the ability to amend or to change that bill is fairly restricted. It is very rare that there's an easy way or pathway procedurally under the parliamentary rules of those bodies to just bring up an amendment, an idea, a tweak, or sometimes to sort of ask political questions or make the opposite party take a tough political vote. Those are more difficult in the House and Senate. But in the House of Representatives, in a committee hearing, it's an open rule. You can offer any amendment that you want. And that is constrained by something called germaneness, or sort of a legal term for relevance to the topic at hand, which I can talk more about in questions and answers that comes up. But by and large, you can offer pretty much any amendment that you want. And so this is real legislating. A member of Congress says, I see this bill, I want to get rid of this provision, or I want to add this provision, or I want to turn 100 into 200. And they give that text of that amendment to everyone. They speak on it for a bit. The other members debate, and then it's voted on. So it's a kind of a live fire work to find compromise, to find common ground, or to hold your party together against the members of the other party. If you don't like the amendment that they have, make sure that you stay unified. The debate can get very high-spirited. It can move very quickly. But again, when you want to think about how were any of the significant laws in our history done, or the Constitution written in the Constitutional Convention, these were done through things very similar to a markup. People in a room with text in front of them, exchanging different versions, voting, offering amendments, commenting, debating, critiquing. So a markup is very exciting. Usually they're 2 or 3 hours long, but not infrequently they can be very long. Right now, Congress is thinking about having a large reconciliation bill to move the president's agenda. When the Democrats had a reconciliation bill in 2021, my committee's markup went until 3 or 4 in the morning. It was a 13-hour affair. So these things can be very involved, take a lot of time. So following a markup, assuming at the end of the markup, after all the amendments are either accepted or rejected, they vote on the bill itself. And that decides whether or not it is reported to the floor. If it passes out of committee, then it has a shot at getting considered on the floor. And again, 5,000 bills introduced, only a few hundred considered by committee, only a few dozen maybe make it to the House floor. But so the committee then files a report, writes up the text of the bill. Both sides get to give their opinions on the bill in a written document. You give a record of the votes and things that happen, and that bill is sent to the floor. And I want to keep my opening remarks relatively brief, so I'll try to wrap up here. But even once the bill comes to the floor, the committee manages the debate that happens there. The committee chair, another member of the committee, picks who debates for their party or for the bill. The ranking member from the minority chooses who on their side gets to speak and when about the bill. They respond to any amendments that do happen on the floor. And if it passes the House, then the committee tends to lead most of the negotiations with the Senate or with the House, respectively, on finalizing a bill, because both sides, the House and Senate, have to have a matching bill. And most of the time, the House and the Senate have different versions and have to come to agreement somehow on a common text. And so the committees lead the vast majority of the negotiations on that as well. So the committee process isn't just hearings and markups, but they take right after a bill is introduced, they are in control from then all the way to when it gets ultimately sent to the White House to become a law. And again, happy to talk about germaneness or other aspects of this. How are people assigned to a committee, or the history of committees, or are there special or unique committees? Those are all things I'm happy to answer in Q&A, but I'll wrap up my opening remarks there.
Well, thank you, Cyrus. That was a great summary. And I love your point about how the committees are in control, not just when they're considering the bill and doing what we call the markup, which, as you explained, is really taking the bill and allowing the committee to vote on it and add amendments and things like that, but through the whole process. That's something that I hadn't even thought of, but that's a really good point. So I'm going to turn it over to Janine. Janine, I'm sure you've got some questions.
Yes, I do. Okay. So, Cyrus, thank you very much. My name's Janine Turner, and I'm the founder of Constituting America, for those that are listening and tuning in Las Vegas later in the week. All right. We have a lot of students listening, and I want to kind of back up in an elementary quick fire, lightning round, kind of back and forth about, kind of recap the delightful intro that you just gave us. When we speak to the kids in the school, we ask them to think about something that they would like to change or keep in their neighborhood or in their country. And we teach them then to use the tools in the toolbox in the First Amendment. By the way, we can give these speeches to any school. If anyone wants to request one, they can just go to constitutingamerica.org, free. But then we have them write a petition. And we teach them, with parents' permission and all of this, how they use their speech and their press, and now they have a petition, and then they plan their assembly and they call their representative. So that's the beginning of a quote unquote bill. And as we've been walking through this, it's then taken, the representative then takes it, if they think it's legitimate, to Washington, D.C., if it's an issue that warrants national discussion. And what we've learned is that then it goes into committee, and you were talking about the committees. So I'm going to back up, though, just so the kids understand. Does every representative, so the committee is let's just say there are 20 members on the committee. What's the max? What's the minimum and the max, the number of people on committees? Lightning round answer.
I think there are a couple of special committees that are small, like 8 to 13 members. The vast majority of committees in the House are much more like 50 to 70, and in the Senate, you're looking at probably 25, 18 to 25.
That's a lot. Okay. So if you have 70 representatives bringing a petition that they want to turn into a bill and then a law, if you have 75 members of the House coming to that committee to bring their constituents' ideas, how does that work? I mean, you have a room of 75 people. You said there were 4 witnesses, but how do you filter through? Let's say each representative, they can only bring, do they have to choose? Like, okay, I'm from Utah, but I have 5 constituents with really great ideas, but to committee, I can only bring one of these. I mean, first of all, how does that work? Because if you have 75 people and each bring 2 or 3 ideas into committee.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit wilder than that. Remember, you can introduce a bill and it can go to a committee even if you don't serve on that committee. So all 435 members of the House can bring it. You know, if you're in Utah and your representative is not on the education committee, that doesn't mean that they don't get to have an opinion on education ideas. But no, individual members of the committee or the House, they don't get sort of like one or two chips to turn into the committee and say, well, this is my bill I want to move. The committee chair, in coordination with the members of the committee and with the leadership, chooses what does and does not move. So again, right, like a committee chair got their position by working with members and being respected and being there for a while. They aren't just willy-nilly giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to dozens of things and just moving on with their day. There's a lot of consultation. They know the members
But
on
that
their
is
committee.
interesting. That is interesting. And I think Cyrus, that's one of the things that's created so much a discourse lately amongst the operations of the House, is that people are feeling they're not getting a say, and that the power goes into maybe the Speaker of the House to choose. So of course they would be honorable and try to do the right thing, what they think is best for the country, but that is a bit tricky. I mean, so like 150 bills will go past his desk, and so probably someone like you reads through them and then goes to him because he's busy in all these meetings, or her, and says, these are the four I recommend, or the five I recommend. Let's talk about how the chair, Speaker of the House, I guess you're saying, or the chair of that committee, how the chair of that committee makes those decisions.
Well, I mean, they talk to the members of the committee. And it's not typically a top-down process, right? Um, there, there are a lot of laws in a committee's jurisdiction that exist, and many of those laws expire. So at the Education Committee, there was, the Title IV funding, or all of the funding in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, right? And so it's conservative, generally speaking. We didn't want to have a significant federal role in education, but many states come to rely on the funds that they receive to provide education in particular districts or other schools, and those laws expire. And so a lot of what a committee does is they move the bills that are expiring, because I think conservatives don't typically want they don't want programs to run that haven't received authorization from Congress. And so a big chunk of a committee's jurisdiction is, what is expiring, what is due. Do we have a highway bill that we need to do? Do we have to do a bill for ports? Do we have to do the FAA bill for airports? Or every year, the Armed Services Committee moves the National Defense Authorization Act. And so a lot of members introduce small bills, but those are ultimately put into those larger packages. And there are small provisions. This might be, we want to have workforce development for the submarine industry. Well, that can move with the National Defense Authorization Act. So committee chairs.
Okay, so let me stop right there. I just want to keep it simple. Okay. So if 75 members are on a committee and they each bring one new bill, forget about the ones that have expired, that their constituent wants, it's the chair of that committee who goes in and chooses which of the 75 they're going to discuss in committee. Just yes or no. Do I have that correct? Yes or no?
Yep.
Okay. So the chair's going to decide, out of these 75, I pick. And how many do normally will they discuss in a session? The 12? They'll pick about 12. Is that what was that number?
Most committees probably consider over 100 bills in a session, I would think, or a good
100
number.
bills. So how do they have time to go through, if the chair has picked 100 bills, how does the committee have time to have their 4 witnesses and their 5 minutes apiece for 100 bills?
So not every bill gets a full hearing. Some hearings are topic based. So you might have a hearing on trains, and members would raise their individual ideas and talk to the witnesses about their bills there. So not every bill gets a hearing or a standalone hearing. And then they bring up, most committee markups will have a good number of bills, 8 bills, 12 bills or something. And their, members are given several days to know about that. The text is all available. There are briefings that are given.
I'm going to stop you right there. I'm going to stop you right there. Can you define what a markup is?
Yep, that's the meeting that I was raising earlier. So we have two things: hearings. That's where they discuss, issues or bills, with witnesses, outside stakeholders, and then when the committee wants to actually consider legislation.
Are you saying mock-up? I'm sorry, Cyrus. Are you Cyrus? Cyrus, are you? Sorry, I'm sorry. It's hard to hear you. Are you talking mock-up, MOCK, or markup, MARK?
Markup, MARK. So they are marking up.
So in order to mark up a bill, which would be, I've read the bill and now I'm going to go in here and see what kind of changes mark up. That's what you mean, right? Like kind of like a red line. Yes. Okay. So who writes the bill? Right. And I understand that there's a lot of wheeling and dealing, and certainly you may take 12 and put it in this big bill and 12 and put it in that big bill. And I had a petition for to limit the page numbers of the bills, you know what I mean? But obviously I think there's wheeling and dealing from what I'm understanding from you, and that different bills go into different ideas, go into different bills. But in my 2 minutes remaining, who writes up the bill that then gets marked up?
Well, the original bill is written by the member. So for the example that you're talking about, a member of Congress hears from a number of constituents and decides, I think that's an idea worth doing. They have the bill drafted and they introduce it. So the bill is written that way. And then sometimes the committee chair will have an idea and they have that bill drafted. And so it's just an individual member has the bill drafted. There are special attorneys who help provide that, technical language. And then the committee calls up that bill. And then sometimes they merge multiple bills, and then members draft their own amendments to those bills and things like that. But that's the members write the bill.
The members write the bills. Okay, because I thought I heard you say that sometimes the bills get, there may be 12 bills that will kind of go into a big bill. And so then who writes the big bill if they're just trying to incorporate different people's ideas?
Well, they go to the same technical attorneys that write the original bills. They know how to copy and paste and, turn a 1-page bill into a 12-page bill because ideas from other members have been added to it. And then that's just introduced.
Okay, so sometimes if
the members work from there.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate the diving into the minute details of this, because I think when we have a 5th grader, you know what I mean? It's really good to kind of just break it down again and understand it. So to recap, before I tossed to Jewel, it seems to me that the constituents have an idea, they take it to the representative. The representative, if they agree with it, then take it to DC. The chair of the committee will look at, if it's a committee of 75, up maybe to 200 of them, I guess, if each one has 3, or 75 if each representative has 1, and will decide which ones are then going to be discussed in committee. And the original bill will be the one that if it gets chosen, will be the one that the representative wrote himself, or it will be mixed with a few others. And at that point, a lawyer will come in and merge 12 different kind of ideas on the same topic. And that will become the bill that will then go into markups. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I think it's good enough.
Yeah, and I would just jump in if you don't mind. Members, not every member on the committee is going to introduce a bill that might be assigned to his own committee or her own committee. So members introduce the bills on the House floor in the hopper, and then it's decided by, I believe, the leadership, and sometimes the committee chairs have to negotiate which committees that bill is going to be assigned to. So you may have a member of the Education and Workforce Committee who introduces a bill on the floor that doesn't have anything to do with education and workforce. It would get assigned to a different committee. So Would you say that's accurate, Cyrus?
Yeah, the parliamentarian, a nonpartisan official, he determines sort of which committee under the precedence of the House should get the bill, and refers it accordingly.
And there can be big battles between the committees on who gets to receive some of these bills. I know, there were often a lot of battles between the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means Committee for certain bills, because both committees would really want a certain bill, and they would have what they call jurisdictional fights over them. So that's always interesting.
Yeah. Well, so Kathy, when you say that each person puts their, I thought I thought the hopper was kind of eliminated these days. But are you saying that every representative on the House floor gets to stand on the floor and speak their potential idea for a bill before it even goes to committee? And when do they do that? Because you say they have the opportunity to speak about their potential bill on the House floor.
Well, no,
That's a lot of bills with a lot of
Right.
representatives.
No, they put it in the hopper. They don't necessarily speak on it when they put it in the hopper, but there are designated times on the House floor when members can speak near the end of the day. Is that correct?
If a member has an idea, has a bill, and they have it drafted, it used to be a physical box called the hopper, and they would drop the text into the box, the hopper. Now they just email it into a special email address, and it's introduced that way. So they do not need to verbally say anything to introduce a bill. They just have appropriate legal text drafted, and then they email it to the clerk of the House, and it is introduced. And once it's introduced, it's sent to a committee. It's all automatic.
No more oratory skills. Okay,
You can
Jewel,
speak
I'm
on the
tossing
floor.
it to
Lots
you.
of debate happens. No one is silent, but the process of introducing a bill is different than the process to speak on the floor about an idea.
So Jewel, just take your time, and Wyatt, take your time, okay? Because we had a long intro, so it's okay to go ahead and take your full time. So you're saying they put it in the email. I thought it went to the email and then it went into committee, but somewhere between the email and the committee, they do have the right to stand on the floor and talk about it.
The process by which they talk on the floor is a totally different process than introducing a bill. If they can talk on the floor before they introduce the bill, they can talk on the floor after they introduce the bill. If they're introducing the bill, they just introduce it, they send an email, goes to the clerk, and then goes to a committee. And if they want to talk about something, a bill or anything they want, they have different opportunities to do that. But it's not linked with the process by which a bill is introduced.
It's a separate thing. Okay, so Jewel, take 10, Wyatt, take 10. All right, I'm tossing to y'all. Thank you, Cyrus, for breaking that down. It's something that you do. It would be like if you came on a movie set with me, you might ask me 1,000 million questions because you know nothing about the movie industry. And so it's great. These are things that you do in your sleep, but we all try to figure it out. So thank you so much for enlightening us about how this really works, because it's we the people, not we the government. So thank you so much. I appreciate it, really.
Hello, this is Jewel Gilbert with Constitutional Chats. Thank you for being on today, Cyrus. So you mentioned I believe you said parliamentarian, maybe? And you said that, could you tell me the role of this nonpartisan person and what they do, who they are, and is that in between the process of, you just described how the email goes to, it's just like a virtual hopper, and then clerk. Is the parliamentarian there as it goes to signed committee, or is that after?
So I'll talk about the process, and I can flesh out the parliamentarian a bit. A member has a bill. It's drafted by special technical attorneys called legislative counsel. And so those attorneys draft the bill, give it to the representative. The representative sends it to the email, and then that email inbox, that electronic hopper, is controlled by the clerk of the House, who is also a nonpartisan officer of the House of Representatives. And that individual receives it, does a bunch of paperwork stuff, make sure they got the text exactly right, it goes on the internet appropriately, those other things, and they provide that text to the parliamentarian. And the parliamentarian's job is to know the rules of the House and the precedent of it, right? So the House operates according to rules, and the precedent is the history of how those rules were enforced in the past. because, you put 20 words in a rule. Well, there have been 50 different times that rule was invoked, and how was it determined? It's sort of like court rulings. So, if the House has decided, well, we interpret our own rule this way, they make sure that it's done consistently. And in the case of bills, and who's going to, which committee is going to have those bills, the rules of the House explicitly lay out the jurisdiction of each committee, the subject matters on which that committee has authority. So the Education Committee has authority over bills having to do with education. Transportation Committee has jurisdiction over train, other committees, etc. And so the parliamentarian knows those rules and also knows what he did in the past. Some laws actually have multiple committees that have worked on them in the past, different elements. The Civil Rights Act, some of it's a Judiciary Committee, some of it's elsewhere. So the parliamentarian is just a technical official who knows the rules, knows the past application of the rule, and advises on which committee that should go to. So, bill comes in, they read it, they say, no, this needs to go there. Sometimes there's a back and forth. Committees can argue about who gets it. Actually, relatively rare. What people do if they want to game it is they write it special up front so that they know where it will end up at the end of the process. But that, again, is still a relatively narrow. The vast majority of the time, we know who has jurisdiction over something, and people respect that.
Yeah, the parliamentarian has a pretty big job then. That's interesting. So is the committee system developed along with the rules of the Congress, and then what role then does the Rules Committee play in the committee system, since it's kind of like it's like a meta issue there, because it's so confusing of the Rules Committee and then the rules that establish everything that you talked about, but it is a committee on the House. So could you just tell me a little bit about the role and how these rules came about?
Yes. So, the first committee was not the Committee on Rules. So, I think the first committee was the Committee on Ways and Means in the House, which is the committee that raises revenue. Like back then they didn't have national taxes, but, tariffs or other things that were sources of revenue for the federal government. So committees have been around, and the Committee on Appropriations, or what are we going to spend money on and where, these, started very, very early in the history of Congress. In some cases, in the first ever Congress back in 1790 or however that worked, maybe even 1789. But so committees have been around for a long time, and the Rules Committee, the way it operates in the House today, that is something that is, gotten more formal over time. It was not always this way. But now the Rules Committee is jurisdiction in two important ways. One is over the rules of the House. So when the House of Representatives meets to start a 2-year Congress after the election, the first thing they do is elect a speaker. And the second thing that they do is they adopt the rules of the House. So the Rules Committee, it's their job to take the rules from last Congress, make any changes they think are appropriate, have discussions, have amendments, do whatever. And then they bring that forward to all of the members on the first day of the Congress to consider and pass. So the Rules Committee has jurisdiction over the rules of the House in that way. And then it also has jurisdiction in a special way. Any significant bill that comes to the House floor typically goes through the Rules Committee, because issue by issue, week by week, day by day, they determine how many amendments, if there will be any amendments to a bill, are considered, and how long that bill will be debated. And given, I think the students' interest here, they may not want to have a long conversation about procedurally how things come to the House floor and how many amendments they get or don't get. But the Rules Committee is sort of on a day-to-day basis. That's the unique thing that they do, and why they sort of oversee all the committees. But fundamentally, their job was to make sure that the rules of the House reflect the desires of the members of the House of Representatives, which they do at the start of the Congress. You're on mute.
Yeah, awesome. I got one more question, and it's kind of a more of a bigger picture question. So since these are not, if I'm right, these rules are not outlined directly in the Constitution, they've developed over time. Could you kind of talk just, briefly how the way that the committee system operates, how it benefits the American people, or if you think that it needs like major changes, then you could say instead how you think it needs to change in order to better serve the American people.
Yeah, I mean, so the Constitution states that the House and the Senate are responsible for their own rules and procedures, right? Gives them exclusive jurisdiction over their internal proceedings. And both the House and the Senate, formed committees because, you think about virtually any organization in human history, it has committees. If you're on the board of Apple or another corporation, they have subcommittees on those boards. And you think about, if I recall, I think there were committees even at the Constitutional Convention. But certainly, human history always has committees. You can't run an institution by having everyone in the room all the time. Sometimes you need a special place for experts to meet and detailed conversation. Just that way you can get things done at the pace and in the detail that you want. And I also think, I people have their own views on who holds the power in Washington and where that's held or how that's held. But by and large, I think committees are a good thing because they allow more members an opportunity to speak. If we didn't have committees and we only consider things on the floor, then who would be the people who would write the bill or choose the text of the bill that comes? It would be the leadership. Who would decide how many amendments you would get? It would be the leadership, or it would be a select few. There's only so much time. You just couldn't have a lot of people. Whereas in committees, members get to go work on issues that they care about. They get remember that open process during a markup where anyone can offer any amendment, can debate to their heart's content on these things. And it gives Congress the ability to dive deep. If we only had hearings or testimony in the House of Representatives, we wouldn't have the ability to talk about submarines at armed services and trains of transportation and tariffs at Ways and Means, right? We'd have a very limited amount of time. So for those who want to have sort of like a federalist idea, committees are how federalism operates in the House of Representatives. And so you want good and strong committees, but you also don't want committees who are all powerful, because you don't want 400 members of the House to be ruled by just the 35 members on the committee. So you can over idolize the committees, because if everyone who cares about trains is on the transportation committee, well, maybe they're going to overly support trains, and the vast majority of the members of the House of Representatives don't just want to have trains. So don't deify committees, but they are, I think, a very important aspect of how we have real democracy in our republic.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Cyrus. And now I will pass on to Wyatt.
All righty. Yeah. Thank you so much, Wyatt Hensley here. Very fascinating subject. I just got to say, I really liked your point of how the specialization of each committee really helps the government, specifically Congress, function effectively. That was just a very interesting point. So my first question is, so there are different committees that you had mentioned. Can you describe the difference or the different committees and maybe provide an example of each of them?
Sure, like sort of like special committees versus
Yeah, because in my research, I was seeing there was standing, joint, special. So if you could kind of describe what each one does, how they're different, and an example of each.
Sure, yeah. So the standing committees they're sort of like your normal committees. They're committees that have a particular area of legislative expertise. So armed services for the military, education for education, transportation for forms of transport. And legislation is referred to them. They have markups. They move things. That's great. Just kind of basic schoolhouse rock. How a bill becomes a law. Normal committee. Then you have your select committees, and so they maybe can't move legislation, but they are on specific issues. So right now we have a select committee on China and what to do about the Chinese Communist Party. So they have members similar. They have hearings. And they write reports, but they don't move bills. So sometimes Congress will say, we have an important issue. We want to get expertise together there. We want some information. We want some, knowledge disseminated, but this may not be an issue forever. Like, we're always going to have transportation, but God willing, we won't always be dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. So that's why it's a select committee. It's a special issue, like when Benghazi happened 12 years ago, or when President Trump, there was an assassination attempt on him. It wasn't a select committee, it was a select task force in that case. But either way, Congress stands up temporary things to deal with issues that matter right now, but may not be permanent. And then joint committees get very weird. So they are joint means that they're both the House and the Senate members, and there are a small number of them. Most importantly, is sort of like the Joint Economic Committee. So that has members of the House and the Senate, and they sort of provide economic analysis for the House and Senate. But they also don't have the ability to move legislation. They can't move a bill to the House or Senate floor, but they provide, sort of economic background and information for Congress's use. There's also a Joint Committee on Taxation, and that is even more specialized. And they don't do much in terms of providing, lots of background and analysis on ideas. They tend to be really hyper focused on how tax policy, whether it costs money, brings in money, sort of what's the fiscal impact, the financial impact of specific tax ideas. So that's evaluated by the Joint Committee on Taxation. So that's sort of different things that occur.
Yeah, and then just to clarify too, so you're talking about members joining committees being chosen by their party. Is that the same way for each committee, or trying to think of how
Well,
to?
not the vast majority. So both the House and Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, have their own procedures for how they would put members on committees. So by and large, what they have is a special committee on committees. So for House Republicans, it's called the steering committee. And so some members get to be on that automatically. If you are voted by the members to be a member of leadership, you're elected to leadership, you would get to serve on the steering committee. And then they also, in the House of Representatives, for Republicans, we have what we call region representatives. So states or several states combined each get to elect someone to go to the steering committee. So in the House, for House Republicans, we have right now we have about 220 House Republicans, and about a little bit under 40 Republicans got to serve on the steering committee. So it's not by any means all Republicans, but it's also not like 3 people in a smoke-filled room deciding these things. Everybody got to be represented either by leadership that they themselves elected, and also by the regional representative. And so they meet and they decide who gets to go on the vast majority of committees. There are a few committees, and that they decide who goes on those committees by your expertise, right? If you're a tax attorney, you're probably going to get to serve on the tax committee. If you're a high-powered constitutional lawyer, you're probably going to go to the judiciary committee. And if you really, if you have a background or you really have a large port or in your district or a lot of airports, maybe you're on the transportation committee. Sometimes it reflects the district that you're in. So if you have a bunch of military bases, you'd probably be on armed services. And then finally, there are a few committees where there's a unique selection process. So the Committee on Rules is chosen specifically by the Speaker. And that's true of a couple of other, like the Committee on Intelligence, that's selected by the Speaker as well. So there are some narrow things, but generally it's by that sort of special committee on committees.
Wow, yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you. Is there a required number of times that a committee has to meet?
No, the committees have to do certain things. They have to have a first meeting, they have to organize, and they have to adopt rules of their own. And then they lots of rules here. And then they have to like file an oversight plan, but they don't have like a requirement that they meet monthly or daily or anything like that. I mean, all of them meet often, but it's not according to a requirement.
Gotcha. Then you're talking about the role of the chairman or chairwoman. Can you quickly clarify how the chair is selected?
So again, differs by House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats. And again, in most cases, it's the same committee on committees. They choose the members of the committee, and they also choose the chairs of the committee. And in all instances, whether it's members or chairs, that has to be ratified by the wider membership. So if they choose Joe Biden to be chair of the Judiciary Committee, then the members have to approve that. So it's they choose the representatives that they have on the Committee on Committees, and if they don't like the decision that Committee on Committee makes, the members are free to request a vote and reject that decision. But that is where the determination is made initially. Right now.
Yeah, and because you're also saying too that members serve on multiple committees, can a chairman of one committee be the chair of another committee?
Yeah, you cannot chair 2 committees.
Okay. Okay.
at the same time.
All right. Yeah. Just wanted to clarify. And then another question, talking about people getting involved, wanting to in the legislative process. How can people attend these committee hearings? Because when you're watching some of these hearings, you always see people in the background. Are they specifically selected, or how can people attend these committee hearings?
I can't speak for the Senate, although I suspect it would be the same, but in the House of Representatives, it's a rule of the House of Representatives that all meetings be open to the public. So you just show up, you come to the building at the appropriate time, you get in line. Most of them don't have a line. You just get to go in. Sometimes you have something huge, there will be a line. And, when I ran like last year and a half ago, we had the presidents of Harvard and MIT and Penn testify before the House Education Committee. We had a lot of people who wanted to be there. So we sort of had a section for people who got there really early or represented those places early. And then we had another section where people came in and then 10 minutes later they had to leave and go through. But like we try to accommodate people when they come. But it is a rule, essentially, just short of a law that these things be open to the public. As long as somebody's not disrupting events or throwing something.
Yeah. And then one last quick question that I have. So currently at my college, I'm taking a U.S. Congress class, and we were talking about co-sponsorships. Does the number of co-sponsorships affect the bill's progress in the committee system? Could it help or?
Not formally, so it's not a rule like, oh, you have 50 co-sponsors, you get to move, but it certainly is a huge indicator. A bill with more co-sponsors is much more likely to move than a bill with less. And the quality of the co-sponsors matters as well, right? Like, is it people on the committee that are co-sponsoring the bill, or is it just random members, or did you somehow get members of leadership to sign on to this bill? That would matter as well. But yep, co-sponsors are a great thing to have, and they indicate a likelihood that you will get considered.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm about out of time, and I know we have a bunch of audience questions, so I will pass it on over. So thank you so much again. Very, very fascinating.
Well, thank you, Wyatt, and thank you, Janine, and thank you, Jewel. Great questions. And Cyrus, we're just learning so much from you today. We really appreciate you being with us. And before we go to our audience questions, we want to thank our listeners from Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. We thank everyone in Las Vegas who's tuning in to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. These chats air on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to our listeners in Las Vegas. So Cyrus, we do have quite a few audience questions. And first up, let's see, we had Dave who asked, does the speaker typically sit on a committee?
No. Nope, speaker does not, neither does the majority leader, nor I think the majority will. So the most senior members of the leadership do not take up space on committee.
Okay, great. And then Professor James Klinger asked, if a bill is referred to multiple committees, does that increase the probability of the ultimate passage of some version of the bill?
No, because those committees have to agree to move the bill. And sometimes that happens. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it complicates the process. So in most cases, people try pretty hard to write a bill in one committee's jurisdiction. So that is a smooth and easy thing, and you don't have to worry about multiple personalities or viewpoints. But lots of bills that have multiple committees do move, so it doesn't stop it.
Okay. And then Julianne Smith asks, how differently does a committee function for a bill versus oversight and investigation? And maybe you could talk a little bit about the oversight and investigation role of certain committees.
Yeah, it's sort of a topic I guess I really ignored in all of my initial comments. It's a very different process that is much more directed by the chair, even than sort of what is or isn't moved in terms of legislation. So the chair with the committee staff, and again, there's always input from members, and that input is heard. And if you're a committee chair and you're not listening to your members, they will whine to leadership, and leadership will tell you what the heck are you doing, accommodate these members. So people are not brushed aside in Congress, particularly not with these tiny majorities. But yeah, the committee chairs, determine the targets of their investigation. They draft letters. They get members of the committee to sign on to it. They determine information frequently that leads to hearings. or other events, and then finally typically culminates in a report or with potentially even legislation or particular enforcement actions that the Congress, limited enforcement actions that the Congress has at its disposal. But it's a huge part of the work that they do, and it's sort of a separate staff. A committee tends to have a large legislative staff and then a smaller oversight staff that is focused on whatever those investigations are. And the two sides talk regularly, but in order to do both jobs right, kind of have different people focused on them.
And does just about every committee have an oversight and investigation subcommittee? Or are there some committees that don't have an oversight and investigation subcommittee?
It's probably something like 50-50. Just because they don't have an oversight subcommittee doesn't mean they didn't do oversight. I mean, we did extensive oversight on House education, on institutions related to anti-Semitism last Congress, and we did not have an oversight subcommittee. So it's just sort of what is the past practice of the committee, and then they see, significant value from that.
Okay. And then William Kramer asks, and you may not know this, but it is an interesting question. Will we still have an education committee in the House and Senate if President Trump does away with the Department of Education? And if there's no Department of Education, where does the legislation that the House Education Committee passes, what branch or what department would it be relevant to?
Let's see here. I guess if you actually got rid of the Department of Education in a lasting way, a Republican Congress would not have a committee on education. Now, the House Committee on Education also handles workforce issues, so all the federal labor laws and other provisions. And there are a lot of elements related to education that, even if you shutter the Department of Education, you're probably not immediately ending Pell Grants and other programs. So, those would still occur, and I suspect the committee would continue to have jurisdiction on them. You might move student lending to the Treasury Department or other things. And again, given time and sufficient congressional majorities, maybe you get rid of federal student lending and that would then go away as well. But, I think in the interim, there's an expectation that some of these things are ongoing. And so the committee, whatever its name may end up being, will continue to have oversight.
Okay. And then finally, Rick Mayberry asks, and we've touched on this a little bit, but Rick Mayberry asks, what is the authority of Senate and House leaders? Will all proposed bills come for a full vote? And I think to clarify that question, maybe, will all bills passed out of committee come, at least on the House side, if they're passed out of a House committee, will they come to the floor for a vote? Or could the speaker block a bill, even though a committee passes it out? Is there a scenario where the speaker might block it for coming to a vote?
Block is a really strong word. I would say that there are, hundreds of bills that are reported out of committees, and the House doesn't have the time and bandwidth to consider all those bills. So some bills are prioritized, and typically in the House of Representatives, the House Majority Leader, at least on the Republican side, sort of determines what bills do and don't come to the floor or when they come to the floor. The House moves hundreds of bills a year. The Senate moves a significantly smaller number. Again, because of the filibuster and other rules they have there. If you can't get 60 votes, you got to get 100. So that's a pretty high bar. Here in the House, we have different procedures, and we frankly just move faster on the floor when we consider things. So you'll get hundreds of bills passed out of the House every year, and you do not get the same number out of the Senate. But it is true that not every bill that moves out of committee immediately moves. And that may be a bandwidth thing. That may be that the votes aren't there. That may be concerns that certain key individuals have with the provisions of the bill that came out. But again, remember, the committees are ultimately responsive to the members of the broader House of Representatives. And so just because the members of the committee feel one way on an issue doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the House of Representatives feels that way. And you want to have all views reflected, both in a process way, not just in a policy way at the end of the day.
Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating hour, and I think we could probably talk to you for a few more hours, but we are right at the top of the hour. So we want to thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise with us. And I know we had some questions come up today about the House floor, and next week we're going to be talking specifically about the House floor. We're going to have former Congressman Robert Hurt on with us. So we're really excited to be delving into the House floor and what happens there. Next week, we invite everybody back, and thank you to all of our audience members for being with us today and all your great questions. And thank you again, Cyrus. Really enjoyed having you.
Thanks. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank
Keep
y'all.
thinking about the Constitution.
Thank you.